Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of the Jug Dog podcast. Today, on this episode, I am going to be talking about the history of dog food on the back of the article that I published just at the end of July on the website. This was originally meant to be episode 1, but for a number of reasons, mostly technical, I wasn't able to do it until now. So if you already read the article, the podcast is more or less just a recap of the exact same article, so there's no need to listen to it twice, although it would be obviously grateful if you did. But anyway, to jump straight into it, for as long as dogs have existed, they've had to eat. Before they were domesticated, they would hunt and kill in packs for their meal. But once they were domesticated, which was roughly about 18,000 years ago, it started to become the human's duty to help them eat. As we learned from the research conducted in the creation of this article and podcast, this was definitely not a gradual process. The diet changed as humans changed the world and advanced in their own food-making technologies. This article aims to finally be the place with the most detailed account of the evolution of dog food and list the key events in history which changed how dogs were fed by humans. Questions that this podcast will answer: what did dogs eat before dog food? When was dog food invented? And when was dog kibble invented? And the reason we actually wrote this article at all is because we've reviewed quite a few brands of dog food in the UK. You can see our articles all throughout the website. But whenever I was reviewing a product, I thought quite often, how did dog food get to this stage where the ingredients in this bag, and how did they get to that point? So I just looked into it, and it took me quite a few weeks to actually do the research. It's quite a complicated subject, and there is no other article available online or elsewhere that has the history of dog food recorded in as much detail as I've done on jugdog.co.uk. I'm quite proud of this, actually. I would probably say that the most detailed history of dog food is actually on this website and in this podcast. But anyway, to start this chain, I started to look at what did they eat before they were domesticated. And essentially, ancient wolves, which is what they were before they became dogs, had to fend for themselves. They were predatory carnivores and would hunt in packs and eat their kill. They would get all their calories from the kill, which would have been very rich in protein and fat, which is the perfect combination for a dog who needs to be strong and to be able to keep warm during the night. Wolves would most likely have eaten the entire carcass, which means the bones and organs would have been consumed as well. And it's important to note that these ancient wolves would be completely different to what we see today, and I'm talking about modern wolves, and the digestive system would be more than capable of handling raw meat. In fact, despite a resurgence of feeding raw meat to a dog, they would struggle to digest without getting sick from the bacteria, and they'd be unlikely to digest bones and organs properly. As you'll hear in this podcast, the domestication process of dogs and how dog food has changed over the years means that the diet of ancient wild dogs is not compatible anymore, but it is an important event to cover to give some context of the evolution. Our next step is early domestication, which occurred 18,000 years ago, although some people do think it was 45,000 years ago, but we didn't find too much information on the latter. And I don't mean latter, I mean former. So scientists can't agree on when exactly dogs officially became domesticated, as the process of wolves turning into dogs would have been a gradual process over thousands of years of breeding and adapting to their new lives. However, in terms of diets, the early domesticated wolf would have been unable to digest anything but animals properly, and the likelihood is that they would have continued to eat meat through hunting or given to them by their new owners. But this was all about to change, albeit slowly. Clearly, owners needed to keep their dogs fed, but they were unable to offer them raw meat all of the time. They needed to try and feed them something else, something that was cheap and easy to get a hold of. In research conducted by Eric Axelson, which was published on Nature.com, the findings suggest that early domesticated dogs' digestive system began to evolve to accommodate starch and sugar, something wolves would not be able to. This theory suggests that early domesticated dogs' diet began to include scraps from their owners and less reliance on raw meat. In effect, this began the process which led to modern canines being able to digest modern kibble. Cereals, bones, potatoes, and whatever the owners would have eaten is likely to have been incorporated alongside the dog's usual raw meat to keep them going. However, farming was not yet common, so the quality and the volume of non-meat scraps would have been relatively low, As a side note, there is evidence that early man began to cook meat 1 million years ago, so early domesticated dogs probably had a taste of cooked meat quite early on in the domestication process. This would have also put more ease on their stomach and the liver, because cooking meat gets rid of a lot of the bacteria. In effect, this could have softened the dog's digestive system because it didn't have to work so hard. And if we're talking about thousands of years, that's quite a long time. And over the course of thousands of years, dogs slowly evolved to be able to digest this new diet. At this stage, dogs would have never known where their next meal was coming from, and as such would eat everything they possibly can. This kind of behaviour still exists in this day and could explain why dogs never seem full, even after they've just eaten. This kind of behaviour would be called feast or famine. Indeed, their prey drive still exists today, so it's important to know that these ancestral dogs would have continued to hunt prey to get the bulk of their calories and nutrition. Despite being domesticated, they would have not struggled to find prey. The dominance of modern civilization and the collapse of a lot of natural wide open spaces for prey wouldn't affect their options until at least the 1700s. It would be quite easy to imagine that early domesticated dogs would still be in packs with owners, but would often leave their presence and hunt and kill anything they see. So the next stage is proper domestication and early farming around 12,000 years ago. According to NPR, humans began to farm basic crops such as peas, lentils and barley 12,000 years ago, with records showing it happened in the Iran/Iraq area. During this time, the role of the dog started to change significantly to resemble the kind of working dogs we have today. However, at this time, dogs would have still been very large and powerful, and not quite the size and slenderness of the modern day collie, as an example. This farming process not only changed the diets of the humans at the time, but dogs as well. They would have likely been given some of the crops to eat, which would have caused havoc with the digestive system at the beginning, but it would have started the chain of events which led to modern dogs being able to digest those kinds of food without problems. By this point, dogs would have started to become more and more domesticated to the point that behaviour began to change from hunter companion to working dog, which could help protect the crops from other animals. It's likely that the main source of food would still be coming from the spoils of the hunt, which would be the raw meat and the rest, as farming techniques would still not be anywhere near what they are today, nor would be the refining of those crops either. Next, we took a look at 9,000 years ago with domesticated livestock and a new source of meat for dogs. According to How Stuff Works, humans began to harvest and domesticate livestock 9,000 years ago. This meant that humans had easier access to meat and other animal byproducts such as their wool and hides. It would not be beyond the realms of imagination that the faithful companion dogs, who would have been domesticated for quite some time at this point, also got in on the action and got a hold of meat that they didn't have to hunt for, as well as bones and etc. This could signal the turning point when dogs stopped being just hunters who would roam with their humans and started becoming working dogs who would not only hunt but guard the growing agriculture boom without as much need to travel long distances in search of food and shelter. So at this point in time, humans started to travel a little bit less, especially normal dog-owning humans. So they have a farm with animals, with crops and all the rest of it. So dogs started to have a static home. So their dietary requirements would have changed because they need a bit less energy, but it would still need to be active enough to be able to guard. So farming is the focus of the next couple of sections. 7,000 years ago, and the next level farming and an abundance of starch. Looking at the same study we mentioned earlier from Eric Axelson, Science Mag pulled from it that 7,000 years ago, dogs started to eat so much wheat and millet that their bodies were forced to create more starch digesting genes to cope. This is clearly because the farming skill of dog-owning humans reached such a level that there was an abundance of crops, more than enough to feed the dogs who at this stage probably need to hunt less as they got so many calories from the crops themselves. To put it into context, dogs have between 3 and 30 starch digesting genes. I'm talking modern dogs, whereas modern wolves only have 2. Without these genes, modern day dogs would not be able to eat the mass-produced kibble we feed them today, as a lot of it does include starchy sort of ingredients. It's worth noting that the humans also went through a similar change to get these new genes to adapt to the new diet. So I mentioned at the beginning the objective of my research was to find out how we got from point A to point B. And it is a gradual process, but this at the start here is, well, if you've ever thought, how is a dog able to digest, these sort of biscuits when they've not been around for that long? Well, they started because by being able to evolve to digest the sort of ingredients that were fed to them slowly over thousands of years. But also around this time, physiological changes would have also happened, particularly in dogs' teeth and jaws. The teeth slowly became larger and flat to be able to properly chew the food they were given, rather than the razor-sharp teeth of wolves, which are designed to tear meat off the bone. However, human interference in terms of selective breeding will have been the biggest factor in the physical evolution of dogs. So, before they became domesticated, wolves would hang around in packs and they would mate with other wolves of almost, the identical sort of breed. But as humans got involved, humans played as much of a part in their breeding as the dogs did themselves. So they would be able to breed the most powerful, the fastest, the cleverest. They could potentially breed with other farmers' dogs to try and get like a hybrid. But it started all the way back then. Startingly, we are still thousands of years away from canned wet food and crunchy kibble, but it's clear just how much influence humans have had on dogs' diet and in fact their entire evolution to the present day. I think it's a surprise to anyone that humans are the reason why dogs eat what they eat today. The evolution and history of dog food still has plenty of twists and turns before we get to the present day, though. Now we get to a bit more of a recognisable calendar date, and we are going back in time to between 330 and 37 BC, and the introduction of whey. So this was 2,330 years ago. We have a quote from an ancient Roman poet called Virgil, who said in Latin, but I'll translate, "Do not let the care of dogs be last, but the swift Spartan hounds and fierce mastiff feed the way." I mentioned breeding earlier, so now we've got recognisable breeds. So they're definitely not wolves anymore. And he mentioned 2 breeds, Mastiff and Spartan Hounds. But that's, a topic for another time. From this quote, we can deduce that humans cared about the quality of the dog food given to the companions, and that dogs should not be seen as an afterthought. Do not let the care of the dogs be last. It's also evidence that around 37 BC, the ingredients of whey is now added and encouraged with what we already understand up to this point, which was meat and crops. This doesn't tell us exactly when whey was first introduced to dogs, only when it was written down that it was recommended to them. That's why, obviously, it was 330 to 37. Whey is a common animal product, a byproduct widely used in protein shakes, baby formula today. Whey was discovered approximately 5,500 years ago in Poland, but the milk curd was thrown away and it wasn't thought to be edible until 2,500 years ago, and was even prescribed to sick patients by Hippocrates of Kos. Whey would have been a great addition to a dog's diet as it's very fatty and full of protein, similar to meat and certainly healthier than carb-rich crops, and ideal for working dogs. At this time, almost all dogs would have been working dogs, unless they were wild. Therefore, the time whey was actually introduced to dogs is still unknown, but can be estimated by us to be between 330 BC and 37 BC, based on the quote from Virgil and later its use by Hippocrates. It is unlikely that dogs were fed only whey, so we would make the assumption that they began to have quite the varied diet of meat and meat scraps, wheat, barley, and byproducts of these ingredients and whey. Virgil certainly didn't invent dog food, but he was one of the first known sources that we could find anywhere to write literature on how to care for dogs. We are now going to fast forward to 70 AD, where dogs started to have more of a varied diet and inclusions in agricultural guides. So this was 1,950 years ago. So in 70 AD, a prominent Roman agriculture writer called Columella pretty much confirms everything that we theorized up until this point. But in his work on agriculture, with one addition: if you can't give your dog barley, confirms on suspicions that dogs still eat crops and whey, then try to give them bread mixed with the liquid from cooked beans. This suggests a couple of things about dog food at the time. Meat may not be so readily available from farming livestock as to give them to the dogs, but also that they no longer hunt for the meat. This isn't to say it is true for every dog around the world at the time. We theorize that the typical dog's source of food at this point was entirely the responsibility of the human owners and keepers. This was probably the case for quite some time, but there wasn't any confirmation until Columella's work. Whey is once again mentioned and given further recognition as a staple ingredient of a dog's dinner. It appears that Virgil's recommendations were followed by the mass population and obviously pushed by Columella and his work. It's interesting that Columella mentions adding the liquids from cooked beans. This is likely to make the dog food palatable, similar to how dog owners in the present day would mix in wet food alongside the dry kibble. As an interesting side note, it's clear that the actual beans are too valuable to feed to the dogs. Next, we're going to fast forward to between 224 and 651 AD and the recognition of the companionship in dogs and the importance of a suitable diet. So this was approximately 1796 to 1369 years ago. In a series of literature called the Vendida, collecting in works called the Avesta, there is a specific chapter related to dogs written by Ahura Mazda, who specifically discusses a diet which is suitable for dogs at the time, which reads, O Spitama Zarathustra, it is the dog of all creatures of the good spirit that most quickly decays into age, while not eating near people, and watching goods none of which it receives. Bring it unto him milk and fat with meat, this is right food for the dogs. Within this quote, we learn that Mazda connects a dog's relatively short life is due to the fact that they were not eating near people and instead they were able to see many human foods but not allowed to eat them themselves. He is therefore suggesting that in his view, dogs would benefit from eating near their owners and even eating the same goods as them to prevent premature decay into age by the dogs. Within the final line, Mazda specifically addresses the contents of dog food at this time, which is milk and fat, which is possibly still whey, and meat. We've previously made the assumption that dogs still ate meat despite the lack of quotes, but the Vendida confirms our suspicions. We can also assume that meat is now accessible enough for dog owners to feed it to the dogs. Interestingly, the Vendida doesn't cover feeding dogs wheat and barley, or products made with those ingredients, but we know from future entries that this was still fed to some dogs in some areas of the world. Quite a big jump next, and it's to the medieval times, so around 800 years ago, 1200 AD. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, it became more and more obvious from various pieces of literature that dogs were becoming more and more like pets and not just companions guarding the home, the farm, and during a hunt. According to Dr. Kathleen Walker Makel, who is the author of Medieval Pets. This changing dynamic and the constant progress of farming and understanding of nutrition would have had a direct impact on the food that dogs at the time would have been fed by their masters. An example of this came from Gaston III, who wrote in his book on hunting entitled Livre de Chasse, and paraphrased by medievalists, besides being fed bran bread, the dogs would also get some of the meat from the hunt. If a dog was sick, he would get better foods such as goat's milk, bean broth, chopped meat, or buttered eggs. So finally, the dogs do get some beans. He goes on to add, dogs were to be fed small portions several times a day. The food was usually meat soaked in a beef soup, but could also include bread and milk, and would be served tepid or cold, so that the dogs would not vomit it. This is the first time we've learned about how often a dog is fed in the past, but it also reaffirms how constant a dog's diet has been for thousands of years, consisting of meat, bread, and milk. So it would seem that the scholars at the time had moved on from whey and now onto proper milk, under the assumption that farming methods had come a long way where milk was in abundance. The liquids from cooked beans are still in use. It's important to note that this book was based on the diet of a hunting dog, so the likelihood is that many other working or companion dogs may not have necessarily got their meat from hunting, but rather from livestock and scraps. And it's also an important point to say that this article, and myself having written it, we just gather everything that's available and we try to make assumptions, but we couldn't possibly guess what every dog all over the world would have been eating. But we can make assumptions that, well, if these dogs in this area ate it, then dogs in other similar areas probably would have ate something similar. So meat, bread, and milk probably was what most dogs would have eaten by owners. Pet ownership was not a global thing back then. It would have, it was growing exponentially, but not to the same rate as we have obviously today. The Dark Ages spanned a very long period of time, and a lot of scientific progress was halted because of said Dark Ages. So we don't have an awful lot of information between the medieval times and modern day. So our next entry is actually 1770, which is 250 years ago, and the first appearance of wet dog food. ? In an entry to a French dictionary called the Nouveau Dictionnaire Universel des Arts et des Sciences, you can easily translate that to the New Dictionary for the Arts and Sciences, the author mentions that dogs can be fed a pâté, which contains a mixture of breadcrumbs and little pieces of meat given to pets and presented as a moist paste. In another French scientific journal called Encyclopédie au Dictionnaire Raison des Sciences des Arts et des Métiers, they mention the practice of removing the liver, heart, and blood of a downed stag and mixing it with milk, cheese, and bread, and then giving it to the dogs. Since the Middle Ages, it seems the content of dog food is still roughly the same: meat, milk, and bread. This has actually been the diet for thousands of years, and we've alluded up to this point. The biggest change in terms of dog food in this time was the quality of the food given to the dogs who belonged to wealthy owners. It is also understood that dogs were more commonly seen as pets now, and not just working dogs. So the diet between the two probably varied in terms of quality of the ingredients. When you really look into it, there isn't much difference between milk, meat, and bread and what dogs eat in the present day. It's just how it's presented. However, it's clear that historically the owner would have had to go into a lot of effort to obtain it, and the kind of food dogs would eat would perish quickly. Our next entry is 1860 and the birth of the dog food industry. This was 160 years ago, to give it some context. Up until this point, there were many people who would give guidance on what dogs should eat, but it was really left to the individuals to get the ingredients together and to feed them. So now, if we want to feed our dogs, we go to the shop. But before shops, what would the people do? They'd have to get it from somewhere, either their own livestock, a local butcher, or something like that, and it would perish. So they would have to make trips constantly. The question of who invented dog food is unanswered, but at least we know what they ate before its invention. There was no company at the time which would pre-package them all and sell them to the masses until James Spratt. James Spratt was a salesman who travelled from Ohio to London to sell lightning rods. Upon docking in Liverpool in 1850, which is not far from when this has actually been recorded, Spratt noticed dogs grouping together in the hopes of getting some uneaten ship's hardtack, and presumably enjoying them. Ship's hardtack were a simple snack which didn't spoil quickly and had some basic nutrition, making it ideal for sea travel. Ingredients were stone ground flour, water, and salt, which were mixed into a stiff dough, baked in a hot oven for 30 minutes, and then left to harden and dry. At this point, we know that dogs were not strangers to these ingredients. After this discovery, Spratt went to work mass producing these biscuits by offering them to the middle and upper classes, and then beyond after that. The rest is history, but this was a significant development in terms of dog food, as it demonstrated two things. There was a demand from dog owners for ready-made food. As we've alluded, it would perish quickly otherwise. There was money to be made in the newly formed dog food because of its convenience. I mean, it was probably cheaper than having to get the food themselves. And if they got poor quality, the dog probably died early or were unhealthy. These biscuits weren't just rebranded ship's biscuits. Spratt made some noticeable changes to the formula, which includes the inclusion of meat. However, what remains a bit of a mystery is the exact details of the meat. Nevertheless, they were a smash hit, and following massive success enjoyed in the UK, Spratt moved back to America to establish America's dog food industry as a pioneer. Spratt's was acquired by General Mills in the 1950s, and they continue to make dog food using the Blue Buffalo brand. James Spratt didn't invent dog food, but he did invent the dog food industry and paved the way for someone to come in to actually invent it properly. And despite everything that we've covered up until this point, this is likely to be the biggest catalyst in the evolution of dog food so far. Sadly, the biggest catalyst in terms of dog food is money. Now, fast forward only a little bit to 1880, and someone is trying to improve the formula and made medicated dog bread. So this happened 140 years ago. Despite James Spratt's work, most dogs were still fed human food such as meat, which was often raw, milk, bread, and if they're lucky, a dog biscuit. In 1880, American veterinary A.C. Daniels released his medicated dog bread, which claimed to be a much more refined snack free of ingredients related to indigestion, constipation, and skin ills. This tells us that 140 years ago, dogs still did not receive enough fibre, which would lead to these conditions. Skin ills are also born out of a poor diet and possibly allergies from certain ingredients such as grains. So this tells us that A.C. Daniels is aware that dogs are fed a load of rubbish and don't feel great afterwards, even with Spratt's biscuits. Unfortunately, a trend of big companies was to package inferior goods unfit for human consumption, put them in a bag, and package them as dog food. It could be argued that dog food took a turn for the worst at this point in time, as the thought of making money came before the well-being of the dog. But I want to clarify that point. So, the biscuits and the medicated dog bread were probably better than some of the rubbish that poor families were feeding their dogs. But at the same time, they made food based on convenience and not the ingredients. So it was slightly better, but they still didn't really care about the nutrition that much. Cared more about the money. A.C. Daniels was the first person post-industrial revolution to think about the nutritional needs of the dog, but they were certainly not the last. This is a strange sentence to write or read, considering there were scholars thousands of years ago that recommended a good diet, and now only a few hundred years ago, that seems to all be forgotten about thanks to the growth of capitalism, which would have been rampant at this point. As an early spoiler, it won't be until 1964 before the Pet Institute came in to try and regulate this industry, because there was hardly an industry to regulate yet. Dog food got a level up in 1908, which was 112 years ago. In 1908, a company called F.H. Biscuit Company, who was later bought out by Nabisco, developed new and improved dog biscuits which were shaped like bones. They were sometimes labelled as maltoids, malt referencing the key ingredient in their production. Between 1915 and 1926, cow's milk was introduced as a core ingredient, which led them to become a brand which should be familiar with any dog owner, Milk Bones. As we've covered extensively, dogs are no strangers to dairy, and were able to digest these biscuits well enough for owners to keep giving it to them. Over time, meat was introduced to these biscuits that had a variety of flavours on offer. Milk Bones would have not been given as a dog's main source of food, but these would have been used alongside these meals to help with training and bonding. Dog treats and dog food, but it's an important event in time as it shows that dogs are now fed treats alongside their meals, and further evidence that the dog food industry was in full operation. Some articles suggest that owners would in fact feed them just these dry biscuits. So perhaps they were classed as dog food. But anyway, dogs were firmly seen as pets and companions now, with many not used as working, guarding and herding. It wouldn't be long until someone monetised the entire diet of the dog, and that year was 1922, when dog food got canned and mass-produced. This is 98 years ago. Canned dog food began life as horse meat, and was introduced in 1922 by the Chappell brothers and was called the Ken-L ration. They started off using excess horses left over from World War I, and then by the 1930s they began breeding horses for the purpose of just making dog food. Horse meat has had a troubled past, not just in the United States but elsewhere too. Yet, this is how canned wet food began life, like it or not. The question of who invented dog food has finally been answered. This food became so cheap and convenient that it quickly dominated the market and crushed the previous makers of dry food and biscuits. By 1941, on the outbreak of World War II, canned dog food had 90% of the market share, which meant that an overwhelmingly large majority of dog owners, fed their dogs either Kennel Ration or another similar brand. Kennel Ration became so big that they began advertising on radio programs such as Rin Tin Tin, and let's remember that radio programs at that time is the equivalent of being advertised on Sky or Netflix or something like that. Despite its murky beginnings, the exploits of James Spratt and the Chabot brothers started a trend which has more or less stayed exactly the same since. You feed your dog wet meat and treat them with biscuits. However, the days of dry dog food were far from over once the world engaged in warfare once more. In 1925, dog meat meal was introduced, which was 95 years ago. Despite the dominance of Kennel Ration, other manufacturers were still looking for new ways to exploit the growing dog food market. In 1925, American company Gaines Burgers developed the technology to create meat meals. Meat meal involves a process of overcooking the meat until it becomes a concentrated protein powder. This powder can then be pressurized so that it forms something similar to what we now know as kibble. The kibble was originally sold as massive 100-pound bags before they were then reduced to 10 and 5-pound bags. Meat meal was easier to mass produce. It needed less original meat to work with and still provided a lot of nutrition to the dog, even if it was, covered in protein, which it would have been, and quite difficult for the liver to deal with. But either way, this meat meal was a delight to owners, but dogs could often find it difficult to chew and struggle with digesting. Like I said, because of the high protein content and not so much fibre. Fibre isn't found in meat. Gaines Burgers were successful, but they were still up against the empire of Kennel Ration, and so made slow progress. By 1943, Gaines was a national brand and was purchased by General Foods, but like we mentioned earlier, Kennel Ration had 90% of the market share. But we needed to make sure that we included the export of Gaines Burgers because it proves really important later on. And by later on, I mean now. In 1956, the rationing of meat and the emergence of dry dog food kibble as a big player. This was 70 years ago. The boom of horse meat filled canned food burst after the outbreak of World War II, as food needed to be rationed for soldiers and people at home. Even household ingredients such as flour were quite hard to come by, which affected the biscuit industry. If there was any flour, it would more likely be used for human consumption rather than dogs. Dry meat meal still wasn't able to dethrone the likes of Kennel Ration, but the tide was about to turn when Ralston Purina, which is the same Purina that we all know today, started using their extrusion method from their cereal line to dog food a few years after the war. Canned food took a downturn during the war, and a slow recovery enabled new technologies to take a big bite out of the market. The extrusion method is summarised perfectly by 1987.co.uk. The extrusion process itself worked by combining the wet and dry ingredients in the recipe to make a doughy mixture. This mixture is then put in a machine called the expander that cooks it using pressurised steam or hot water. So sounds similar to what Gaines Burgers do, but not quite. Purina were already using this method to create their Chex cereal. All they did was apply it to dog-friendly ingredients, and in 1956 the world had its first ever dry dog food, Purina Dog Chow. However, this was not necessarily a great thing for the dog. Early use of extrusion method could destroy a lot of the nutrition, especially the fat and protein, so it was a case of convenience and price in exchange for a decent meal. All the moisture is taken away. Despite its controversies, canned horse meat was probably closer to a dog's natural diet than dry kibble. Dry food in the 1950s, 60s and 70s was not nearly as nutritious as the dry dog food you can buy today. But the advertising and marketing machine was in full motion and there was nothing stopping them, or was there? In 1964, the message was processed is best, and the PFI and the PFMA was introduced, which was 56 years ago. The reason most people around the globe, especially the US and UK, believe that processed food is the best food is because of the introduction of the Pet Food Institute and the Pet Food Manufacturers Association in 1964 and the mid-70s. The entire dog food market now had a centralised voice and a recognised authority behind it, and a wealth of money to be able to market not the brands but the whole idea of ready-made dog food as being superior. These two giant bodies brought a lot of good in the years following their foundation, but it was a turning point that the processed dog food was now the only thing owners should feed their dogs, and all the diets, such as raw food, were substandard and not ideal. This was a major turning point in the industry and comparable to how the formula milk industry had the power and wealth to crush any opposing pro-breastfeeding groups. The marketing was so intense, and still is, that it is difficult for anyone to believe otherwise. However, this change was not negative overall. These governing bodies and others which are similar helped to dramatically improve the quality of the processed food, and without the research, dog food wouldn't be where it is today. It may have started off as a way to cheaply feed dogs without a thought about the nutritional content, but today the dog food standards are far and away better than 50 years ago. In 1982, feeding stuffs regulations was published, and as well as the establishment of nutritional requirements. This is now 38 years ago. In 1982, the specific legislation regarding pet food was introduced and called the Foodstuffs legislations. You can see a copy from the blog itself in the UK. In 1985, the American equivalent, NRC, published their Dog/Cat Nutrition Requirements Manifesto. These two pieces of legislation and literature demonstrated that manufacturers needed to take more responsibility for what's in their product to ensure that it's labelled correctly and were free from a certain list of additives and contaminants. Since they were published, they have been updated non-stop as research was conducted and still is conducted round the clock. There's no need to go into specifics here, except to highlight when this movement began and what impact it has had on the food in your dog's bowl today. Slowly but surely, scientists discover what the perfect man-made meal for our dog is, and how it can be manufactured safely and cheaply. Without these rules and laws, manufacturers will be free to put whatever they want in their product at the expense of your dog, like the early days of biscuits and the kennel ration. History has shown that humans and dogs have gotten along for thousands of years. Many scholars wrote about the importance of a good diet. Sadly, when the dog food industry boomed, the focus was more on the money, but thankfully, history was corrected with the introduction of these governing bodies. Dog food was only going to get better from now on in. And how long into this podcast until I said that things were only going to get better? In 2002, setting high standards, the FEDIAF animal feed legislation, which is 18 years ago. At this point in time, every country and continent had their own internal method of establishing good practice when it comes to making pet food. We only try and add key moments in this podcast, so it's important to remember there were plenty of updates and improvements to dog food outside of what we've covered. We've just tried to cover what you definitely need to know. However, as we are a UK website, the biggest noteworthy change since the last is the introduction of FEDIAFs, which is the European Pet Food Industry Federation 2002 regulation, which establishes the food law. This massive piece of legislature lays down food safety requirements, traceability, and the responsibilities feed business operators have over their product. Using scientific research, these new rules ensure that the food that the dog you will eat in the EU, at the very least, is safe and has a minimum level of nutrition. Since 2002, it has been a constantly evolving piece of legislation which tightens how much manufacturers can get away with. The latest update was in 2018, which would demonstrate how pet food standards are still actively working to continuously improve the pet food industry and obviously the dog itself. In 2002, establishing the nutritional requirements of dogs and cats 14 years ago. In 2006, the NRC released a guide on the nutritional requirements of dogs and cats. In 2008, using NRC's work, FEDIAF then published their own set of requirements. This guide differs from the legislation as it specifically discusses the nutrients and minerals dogs and cats needed rather than how safe it is. This work changed the industry's thinking from what we think dogs need to what we know dogs need, and paved the way for many new ingredients to start to be added to finally offer a complete and balanced meal. This important piece of work is why your shop-bought dog food now has more vegetables, less meat, and many more beneficial additives such as fish oil, prebiotics, and fibre. These guidelines have been updated as little back as 2019 and are constantly evolving. The NSC and FDF work together to now be able to offer guidelines for elderly dogs, dogs with allergies, and even cater for specific breeds. Puppy food in particular is well researched. And the last section, before we conclude, is 2020 and beyond, and a little bit of our statement and our, I suppose, opinion on all the research that we've done up until this point. Today's households differ in terms of what dog food is offered to the faithful companion. For example, our Jug Dog, Jeff, is fed a mixture of wet food that's a bit like pate. Fourth Glade is a specific brand, and we mix in dry food. We mix it together so the dry food becomes wet, and that's how he is fed. He just won't eat dry food on its own, and wet food just isn't completely. It's too expensive to offer him as just a solid meal, so we mix the both of them together equally. However, a balanced view would see modern dog food as a mixture of wet dog food, which may be canned or in pouches, as well as dry dog food made with the extrusion method. Yes, the extrusion method is still used today, and it's old as 1956. However, today you have a wider range of options which can cater to activity levels, breeds, life stage, and health issues, and that's thanks to a competitive capitalism climate where every manufacturer looks for an edge to win dog owners' attention, which is ironic because at the beginning I slammed capitalism for the way they behaved in regards to the dog food industry, how they were so focused on making money. But now people have got to be different and quality to make their money, so it's come around almost full circle. Not only that, the regulatory bodies, which started as a way to market processed food effectively, ended up being a group which pushed the quality of the food as far as they can and continue to do so today. Modern dog food may not be the natural way, but it has become so good that it's about as close you're going to get with literally offering raw meat, which we must add may not be the best anymore to the change in modern dogs' digestive system, which ironically humans helped to create. As technologies continue to improve more and more, products and innovations are made such as dehydrated dog food and bespoke dog food packages, so who knows what the future holds. If you were to look at any of our pages on where we've reviewed dry dog food, wet dog food for flatulence, dog food for grain-free dog food, and all the rest of it, and if you look at the ingredients, there's like carrots, cabbage, raspberries, blueberries, lamb, chicken, turkey, prebiotics, FOS and MOS, and all sorts. It's a human could probably eat it. They wouldn't enjoy it, but they would probably eat it because it's come that far, to be honest. So, to conclude this podcast and let you go, what have we learned from our research? Well, the history of the food humans have given their dogs in tens of thousands of years long has been constantly involved. Humans have always shown an interest in how to feed their dogs and varying opinions on what to give them. What our research has shown, though, is that humans more or less controlled the evolution of doggy diets, and our influence is the reason they eat what they eat. For better or for worse, they began with a raw diet on the spoils of the hunt, to wheat and barley, from crops to whey and milk, dog biscuits, canned horse meat, extrusion method, and now wet food and dry kibble, and the modern technologies such as dehydrated food. What's clear is there are two major timelines which are pre-mass production and post-mass production. In our opinion, James Spratt and the Industrial Revolution had the biggest impact on dog food, and that was only 150 years ago, in a history which could have gone back 45,000 years. Modern dog foods have come a long way, and if you look at the ingredients of the label, it's clear that they are now eating the same kind of foods humans do, except it's presented differently. There is also a new wave of raw foods emerging in the market which takes a dog's diet to thousands of years ago. We hope you've enjoyed learning about our take on the history of dog food. And if you've got any ideas, inclusions or corrections, we would love to hear your thoughts. So thanks very much for tuning in to another episode of the Jug Dog podcast. We hope this episode has been enlightening. It has actually been incredibly enjoyable doing the research and getting it all written down and recording just right now. It is a fascinating history. It can be quite boring. I think what people are potentially looking for is who actually invented it. But really, there's a lot more to the history than just that moment. But again, thank you very much for listening.